everybody, and welcome to the third episode of 100 Years in the NFL, A Historical Journey. I am your host, Alex Chris. I hope all of you really enjoyed our first episode covering the 1964 Buffalo Bills and their run to the 1964 AFL Championship. Today, though, we're going to talk about the 1968 New York Jets and their run to the AFL Championship and their upset over the Baltimore Colts in Super Bowl III. So let's talk about them a little bit. Similar, though, to the 1964 Bills, though, the Jets also had a really good defense, but it was their Hall of Fame quarterback, Joe Namath, who was the big star of the team. But what's really interesting about the 1968 Jets' journey to the championship, it actually begins almost 6 years earlier to the date in 1962 when this franchise was just coming out of bankruptcy. So let's delve into this story a little bit here. So, following the 1962 AFL season, the owner of the New York Titans, which was the Jets' previous name, and the Titans owner was Harry Wismer. He was one of the original founders of the American Football League. He sold his team after filing for bankruptcy due to the lack of popularity of the AFL at that time. It was only in its third year, and it was still just kind of on the brink of almost not existing anymore. But what was fortunate, though, was that after the franchise was put up for sale, there were two owners who really bought to the chance to get the Titans back to legitimacy, and those owners happened to be Sonny Werblin, who was the president of MCA TV at the time, and there was also a second purchasing partner named Leon Hess, who was an oil executive at that time as well. So they bought the team and they renamed it the Jets in order to combat with their crosstown counterparts, the New York Giants. So it was a huge stepping stone in the right direction for the new franchise. But the thing was, though, is that the new owners of the Jets, they needed to find a new head coach in order to bring the Jets to the popularity of the American Football League, because in their first 3 years, the Titans had a combined record of 19-23, so it was a struggle for them in their first 3 years. But fortunately, though, for the new owners of the Titans, they were able to find their next head coach in Weeb Ewbank, who was just fired by the Baltimore Colts of the NFL at that time, but he had led them to two NFL championships in 1958 and 1959 before he was outed in 1962, even though he had a mark of 7-7. So it was big for Ewbank to try and reprocess the Jets franchise a little bit. And here's another really interesting note about Ewbank as well. He also had another really interesting credential as an assistant coach under Hall of Fame head coach Paul Brown's Cleveland Browns back in the late 40s to the early 1950s. So he really had a great resume before coming to the Jets in 1963. And as I said earlier as well, because the Jets were 19-23 in their first 3 years, they still had to rebuild their team in the right way. And in Ewbank's first 3 years, from 1963 to 1965, the Jets finished 5-8-1 each season, and they did not qualify for the AFL playoffs. But what was really interesting is that Ewbank did a really good job over those 3 years, really developing his team through the draft. And here's some really interesting draft notes for what the Jets acquired during those 3 years. In 1963, the Jets drafted right guard Dave Herman, who was a 27th round draft pick from Michigan State, who became a future AFL All-Star and a really key member of that Jets offensive line. 1964, the Jets also drafted fullback Matt Snell, who was the 3rd overall pick, actually, in the AFL draft that year out of Ohio State. And their 3rd round pick that year in 64 happened to be defensive end Jerry Philbin, who was a 3rd round pick from the University of Buffalo. So they really drafted two really big future AFL All-Stars to help out their offense and their defense that year. But 65, this is really their big draft moment, is when they drafted Joe Namath, the number 1 overall pick in the 1965 draft from the University of Alabama. But they also added another big piece to their defensive line as well. They drafted defensive end Verlon Biggs in the 3rd round of the 65 draft from Jackson State University. So once again, they drafted a big offensive target and also a big defensive target in the same draft. 1966, though, the Jets slightly improved that record of 5-8-1. They went 6-6-2 in 1966, but they also got 2 other big acquisitions as well, this time both on the offensive side of the ball. They drafted halfback Emerson Boozer, who a lot of people remember for his Monday Night Football commentary over the years. He was a 6th round pick by the Jets in 66 from Mid-Eastern Shore University, and then in the 8th round of the 66 draft, they drafted tight end Pete Lamont from the University of Texas. He turned out to be a really big offensive weapon for Joe Namath to throw to 2 years later. So really big draft for the Jets in 66. But in 67, this is when the Jets finally started to get their winning ways going. They went 8-5-1 in 1967, and they also added another big piece to their defensive line as well. They drafted defensive tackle John Elliott, who was a 7th round draft pick from the University of Texas in 67. So really, over the course of those 5 years, the Jets really started to build a really good roster for the players that they had. So in 1968, though, this was a really big expectation year for the Jets following their 8-5-1 record in 1967, and they improved their staff by going into free agency a little bit to pick up some other big-time players to help them out. They were able to acquire right tackle Sam Walton, who was a draft pick for them that year. He was a 3rd round pick from Texas A&M Commerce. And they also acquired in the AFL free agency period at that time, they acquired AFL All-Pro left guard Bob Talamini from the Houston Oilers, who was a champion with the Houston Oilers, I believe, in the first 2 years of the AFL in 1960 and 1961. He was really one of the better offensive linemen in the AFL. And they also acquired a really interesting pickup as well to serve as Joe Namath's backup. That happened to be quarterback Babe Parilli from the Boston Patriots. What's interesting, though, here is that Parilli, he was a 1964 AFL passing champion, and it was really helpful for him to be Joe Namath's backup after Joe Namath had thrown 27 interceptions in 1967. I almost feel the Jets almost got him to almost mature Joe Namath a little bit more so the Jets' offense could improve, and eventually it did, as we will discuss here later in our video podcast here. So really big setups for the Jets offense, and also their big defensive targets as well, really trying to mold this team through the draft and through free agency. It really helped the Jets out big time in 1968. But before we get to their schedule and their important statistics, let's single out a couple of other key offensive and defensive players here from the 1968 Jets. We talked about Joe Namath, of course, and his halfback Emerson Boozer, but he also had 2 really good wide receivers as well. His first wide receiver we're going to talk about is George Sauer. He was an undrafted free agent, actually, from the University of Texas in 1965. And what's interesting here, actually, is that George Sauer's father, George Sauer Sr., he actually was the general manager of the New York Titans in 1962 before they filed for bankruptcy, but his son was later acquired by the Jets as an undrafted free agent, and he turned out to be a really big wide receiver weapon for Joe Namath in their Super Bowl run in 1968. His other wide receiver was a Hall of Famer as well, Don Maynard. He was a 9th round pick by the New York Giants in 1957, but he was cut, though. He was cut by the Giants, I believe, in 1958. He spent a year, I think, in the Canadian Football League in 1959, and then he was one of the first players to be signed by the New York Titans in 1960. So it really helped him to go through that phase from being almost a backup wide receiver in the NFL to really being one of the best wide receivers in the AFL during their 10-year existence. Another big offensive acquisition that the Jets had as well was left tackle Winston Hill. He was an 11th round draft pick actually by Weeb Ewbank's former team, the Baltimore Colts, in 1963, but then he was cut by the Colts in the preseason and signed with the New York Jets that very same year. So it really helped him to mold into the Ewbank system, and he became a really big piece of that Jets offensive line along with right guard Dave Herman. So they really had a really good offense here, but we also talked a little bit about their other defensive players as well, and it starts with their really impressive defensive line. We talked about Jerry Philbin, John Elliott, Verlon Biggs, but what's interesting here, though, about the Jets is that their defensive line coach at that time happened to be Buddy Ryan, who was the architect of the 46th defense of the Chicago Bears in 1985, but one of his first coaching jobs actually was a defensive line coach under Weeb Ewbank with the New York Jets. So he really molded one of the best defensive lines in AFL history that year in '68, with all three of them really being big key pieces for the Jets' 1968 Super Bowl run. They also had another really good defensive presence as well. They had a middle linebacker named Al Atkinson. He was a third-round pick by the Bills in 1965 from the University of Villanova, and he actually was then signed by the Jets in '65 after being cut by the Bills in the '65 preseason. The Jets picked him up, and he became a big linebacker presence for them to help their units separate out. But what's interesting here as well is that his linebacker coach happened to be Walt Michaels, who would later be a Jets head coach as well after Ewbank left, and he still had some really good years as well with the Jets in the 80s, leading them to the AFC championship game in 1982. So they had a really disciplined defense with two really good coaches who knew how to orchestrate on the defensive side of the ball. And lastly as well, they also had a really good kicker on their team as well, Jim Turner, as Jets fans know this name very well, but he was a 19th round draft pick though by the Washington Redskins in 1963 from Utah State. And of course, similar to all these guys, he was a preseason cut that year, but then the Jets acquired him in 1964, and he really was a big weapon for the Jets that year to really kick them out of a lot of jams and some big game-winning field goals for Turner during the 1968 season.
First, the AFL needed a network. Just months before the league's 1960 debut, it found one in ABC. The deal was negotiated by New York Titans owner Harry Wismer, a former broadcaster who knew how to put on a good show.
Good evening, everyone. This is Harry Wismer inviting you to join me on the 50-yard line of the nation's professional gridiron.
He was a famous radio announcer out of the 40s and 50s and an unabashed promoter, a tub-thumping kind of guy. Nothing wrong with that.
He was somebody who would, at the Waldorf Astoria, be milling around the lobby and then sneak off to a payphone to call the front desk at the hotel and ask to have Harry Wismer paged. And someone would assume that something important is going on with Harry Wismer again.
Who's ever heard of a Titan, number one? And of course, Wismer knew what it was all about. The Titans are bigger than Giants. And he wanted something that was perceived as being bigger than the New York Giants. Well, I hate to disillusion him, but there's nothing bigger than the New York Giants were back in those days.
The Giants would be in Yankee Stadium, and we'd be at the Polo Grounds, and a lot of people would come over and park their car in the parking lot at the Polo Grounds, and then they would take the subway back over to Yankee Stadium. So the parking lot crowds were a lot bigger than the stadium crowds.
I was able to go up and shake hands with everyone that was there and congratulate them on coming to the game. About half of them said, "No, I'm here on a comp." And I said, "Well, just to get you started, bring a paying customer next time."
Mr. Wismer really thought we were going to have an average crowd of 40,000 to 50,000 people. And when that didn't happen, he was on such a short budget that he just couldn't function.
Going to Harry's apartment, and the bedroom was like the ticket office. So there'd be all these thousands of tickets spread out on beds and floors and everything. But that was the office.
How let him talk me into going up there, I don't know to this day. biggest mistake I ever made. Worst damn place I ever saw. We used to play there when I was at Washington. That's where the Giants played their game. But it had been run down and it was dirty, and we never worried about the people in the stands because we had them outnumbered and we damn felt safe all the time. We could go up there and whip everybody that's in the game.
Here's Frank Gifford, all-pro halfback.
Hey, Joe, are you still using that greasy kid stuff on your hair? What else? Vitalis.
The Giants were doing television commercials.
That's it. Rub it in good.
And we were lucky if we could get a dry, clean towel.
And then try Vitalis.
So Harry tried a novel technique to refinance the team. He married the widow of a former Newark hoodlum named Longy Zwillman. Longy had gone water skiing in the Passaic River with lead skis and, of course, died. And it was assumed that Mrs. Zwillman had quite a stash of Longy's money. Now, it turned out Mrs. Wismer, or Mrs. Zwillman Wismer, didn't really have a stash of money, but we were kind of hopeful, actually. That's how desperate we were. We didn't care where the money came from.
By 1962, New York's Polo Grounds had become a graveyard where Titans owner Harry Wismer was buried in debt.
I remember it was a November day, very sunny at the Polo Grounds. We were practicing, and suddenly there was a kind of an emptiness, a hollowness. And the coaches had surreptitiously slithered off the field. And somebody said, "Paychecks. I'll bet they're paychecks up in the locker room." We realized that the coaches had gotten theirs, and they had a 2 or 3 subway stop head start on us, headed to the one bank, Irving Trust, and the one branch, 39th Street, and the one teller who was authorized to cash a Titan paycheck. He had a window, and he had the total in front of him, and every time somebody cashed a check and he gave him money, he subtracted that, and when he got to 0, he closed the window. You know, we couldn't cash a check or run a bill at Mr. Letterio's grocery store across from the apartment. I mean, Mr. Letterio is a fine Italian gentleman. At one time or another, he'd probably taken care of everybody in the neighborhood, but he just apologized. He said, I read about your husband's football team, and I can't let you have this sausage. So...
3 years earlier, Harry Wismer had been a founding member of the Foolish Club, sharing a common dream with Bud Adams and Lamar Hunt. By the end of the '62 season, his Titans were bankrupt. The league needed a success story in New York, so Wismer's former partners put his franchise up for sale. Whoever owned it next would have to put on a better show than Wismer ever did. In 1963, Werblin had purchased the bankrupt Titans from Harry Wismer. The Titans had been a laughingstock ever since the AFL began.
Because they were so bad, it was like creative destruction, right, in capitalism. They had to be destroyed, and something new had to rise up in New York, the most important market.
New York's AFL franchise was renamed the Jets. The eccentric Wismer was unhappy about the prospect of losing his floundering team. He became even more unhappy when he learned that Sonny Werblin was a potential buyer.
At 21 Club, my dad and Harry Wismer had dinner. Commissioner Foss had expressed to Wismer that my father and a group had interest in buying the Titans.
I expected a lot of people to be bidding, but yet the truth was that there was only one bidder, and that was Werblin.
Harry Wismer, after a few cocktails, yelled an ethnic slur at my dad. My dad was about to go after him.
That's when I said, "Stop it! You know, we've had enough of this nonsense here."
And my father said, "I will own your team in 1 year," and did.
In a sense, the history of the American Football League is the tale of two owners. Harry, who allowed this franchise to disintegrate, and Sonny Werblin. Sonny was the world's greatest talent agent. Came out of Rutgers during the Depression. He became a big band booker, you know, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, all these guys. After television came in, he was the agent for Gleason.
Jackie Gleason, Ed Sullivan, and many of the biggest names in the entertainment business owed their television careers to Werblin. Werblin hired Weeb Ewbank as head coach. In the NFL, Ewbank had coached the Baltimore Colts to 2 world championships. 1 year after getting a new coach, the Jets got a new home.
The millions who will visit the New York World's Fair in the next 2 years will also gaze on a glamorous new sports center, Shea Stadium. New York Cinderella football team, the Jets, take over the park next fall. Okay now, let's go Mets, let's go Jets.
People get history wrong and say, oh, Jets, they named them because of the New York Mets. But that's quite wrong. Sonny chose the name Jets because Shea Stadium was going to be between LaGuardia and Idlewild Airport, and we were entering the space or jet age, and that's how we got the name New York Jets. When we opened Shea Stadium, the World's Fair was still going on.
The New York World's Fair has been visited by 51 million people.
And more than 52,000 fans thronged to see the Jets open the 1964 AFL season against the Denver Broncos.
There was so much traffic because of the World's Fair going on at the same time. People abandoned their cars on the Grand Central Parkway, actually closed off a lane to go to the game.
Werblin's flair for promotion brought show business to Shea Stadium.
He saw the game experience as being an entertainment experience, and that's why he hired this 100-piece Bob Cleveland orchestra. He used to play out in the end zone, created this little model jet, used to run up and down the sidelines.
The largest opening day crowd in AFL history, 53,000 strong, swells Shea Stadium in New York City.
61,929. Count them. They filled the new park from top to bottom.
Let's go, 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 Jets. Let's show them how to move that ball. Let's go, 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 Jets. The Fighting Green will beat them all.
In one word, what he brought to professional football in this country is showmanship.
The fate of the American Football League was determined in New York City for a lot of reasons. New York is the capital of advertising, was then the television networks, publishing, the money, and it was also the home of the New York Giants. The Giants were very glamorous and exciting, and the high-style people began to follow them and try to get into Yankee Stadium.
The Giants definitely at the time had an elitist attitude and I think an image. I think a lot of people sort of resented that, and the Jets took the opposite approach of being a team for the blue-collar worker, for the average Joe.
The average Joe was starting to see an influx of above-average young talent on the Jets. Fullback Matt Snell was drafted in 1964 and won Rookie of the Year honors. Snell had also been drafted by the Giants. His signing represented a significant victory against the Mara family, longtime Giants owners who embodied the entrenched NFL establishment.
The contest between Harry Wismer and the gentleman Maras was a mismatch made in NFL heaven. The contest between Sonny Werblin and the NFL was something quite different.
One time, Wellington Mara saw all the attention that Jets were getting. He wrote a letter to the New York Times sports editor complaining about the amount of space that the Jets were getting in the New York Times. It really showed that we had made an inroad into the scene of New York.
I can't imagine him anywhere else but New York. Can you? Sonny Werblin, I mean, it was perfect. It was a match made in heaven, and I admired Sonny because he was going to take on one of the premier franchises in all the sports in the toughest town in America, and he beat him.
In 1964, passing power was a concern for Sonny Werblin's Jets. Werblin felt that starter Dick Wood lacked star quality. In one preseason game, the Jets owner hoped that former Titan Lee Groscup would emerge as his marquee quarterback.
Sonny and I walked to the stadium, and while we were walking, he said very quietly, he said, "If Lee Groscup has a good day today, I'm going to make him the highest paid athlete in America since Babe Ruth." And I looked at Sonny and I said, "Why?" I had played with Groscup. His achievements were not Ruthian by any means.
Now by Ron Neary, defensive end, causes Titan quarterback Lee Groscup to throw a wobbly pass. And Emo Karras.
Sonny patiently explained that money can be news. Big money can be big news. Lee Groscup didn't have a good day that day. But the point is that Sonny had a check looking for a quarterback. And eventually, the next April, he found the perfect quarterback.
Watch number 12. That's Joe Namath.
A standout at Alabama, Namath was courted by the Jets and the NFL Cardinals.
2 representatives from the Cardinals came to my dormitory in University of Alabama, and we met up in my dorm room. And they told me they had drafted me, which I was aware of, and asked me what I wanted to sign. And I told them $200,000, and they both leaned back. Oh, my goodness, you know, fell down on the bed. The guy was standing here and leaned back against the wall, screaming like they were in agony. And after they calmed down a little bit, I said, "There's one more thing." It's what? I said, "A new car." They said, "A new car, too?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "What kind of car?" I said, "A Lincoln Continental." My first meeting with David A. Sonny Werblin, Mr. Werblin, and Weeb Ewbank took place at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Not my dorm room, at the Beverly Hills Hotel in Los Angeles. Mr. Werblin started out, "Listen, I don't want to quibble over money. We want you. New York wants you. This is what I'm going to offer you. I want you to take it. $300,000 to play for the Jets." I was only thinking of 2 to start with, right? This 300 went up a bit after we negotiated things.
You know, these people here, your future coach and the owner, Mr. Werblin, have referred to you as the greatest football player in college this year. You haven't even put on a Jet uniform yet. You already feel a little bit of pressure?
Well, pressure just makes you go a little more. I kind of like pressure a little bit.
Mr. Werblin, you're the man that's given all this money. We don't know the exact figures, but...
You're not going to know it.
Well, what kind of an estimate, or what can you tell us about it?
Well, Bob, all I can say is that we think it's a lot of money, but it's commensurate with his ability.
All of a sudden, they're giving this guy $400,000. Well, you know, it was a ridiculous amount of money. But it did get you looking, didn't it? I mean, it really put the AFL on the map. I think it was probably the smartest $400,000 that they ever spent in sports.
Well, I doubt if anybody's worth $400,000 right out of college, but I think Joe Namath's going to be a fine quarterback.
Joe Namath, the Jets' $400,000 quarterback, passes to Bill Mathis. Joe Namath, the world's richest rookie, backpedals and fakes to Fake Turner.
It seems to be pretty much the general consensus that he has all those qualities that quarterbacks need to not only last long in pro football, but achieve success. He throws a good firm ball. He has quick release, which seems to be one of the qualities that every coach is looking for in his quarterback.
Courage under fire was another quality that Namath possessed.
Well, any defensive lineman on any team likes to hit a quarterback because the quarterback gets hit less than anybody else. And so when they do hit him, it gives them an extra bit of pleasure, you know. We played the Boston Patriots, and I picked up the safety blitz right on my butt. And I couldn't even sit down. It hurt so bad. I got home, and I took the worst tasting stuff I could find, scotch. And I drank it for 5 years.
Although hampered by gimpy knees, Namath had guts to go along with his gunslinger reputation. It was Namath's heart, as well as his arm, that made him a commanding box office draw.
Namath's name is magic, especially in New York, where record numbers are turning out hoping to see the former Alabama star.
seldom does an athlete come along who electrifies a crowd like Namath.
1968 also marked a breakthrough for what had been the league's most downtrodden franchise. The lowly Titans that played before empty stadiums and nearly went bankrupt were now Joe Namath's Jets, the most popular team in the league.
I was a huge Jet fan. My dad's first pro job was with the Jets for 8 seasons, and the Jets on defense with Jerry Philbin and Paul Rochester, Larry Grantham, Hal Atkinson, Verlin Biggs, and John Elliott. I mean, I know all these guys, that's what's so funny about it. I was like 6 or 7 years old, yet I can always remember them.
In 1967, the Jets owned one of the league's best defenses. Joe Namath became the first player to throw for over 4,000 yards, but he also threw 28 interceptions, and the team failed to make the playoffs.
Joe had to change his ways, and we're all ready now to bring it to management and let them know about it. But they knew it. They came to the players and they said, look, you got to get Joe elected captain. You got to give him some responsibility.
Welcome back, everybody, to 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. We continue with our look at the 1968 New York Jets after we saw a little bit more of the history before their 1968 season, thanks to Full Color Football and their phenomenal work describing the American Football League in their 10-year existence. I'm glad that I was able to share that with you guys. But before we get to their schedule, though, let's talk a little bit about some other important statistics that the 1968 New York Jets accomplished during their championship season. So to start with their offense, the 1968 New York Jets, they averaged 29.9 points per game in 1968. That was the second highest in the American Football League that year. And as far as their passing attack and their rushing attack that year, the Jets' passing attack was the third best offense in the AFL during that time, but their rushing game was a little bit weaker. Their rushing attack was only 8th ranked in the AFL at that time. But what's interesting here, though, is that the Jets' rushing attack, they led the AFL with 22 rushing touchdowns that year. So they kind of played a time control style of offense that year to really help out Joe Namath and to help limit the turnovers as well. And also to help Joe Namath as well, his offensive line was also one of the best in the AFL that year as well. His offensive line only allowed 18 sacks that year to lead the AFL in that category as well. So they had a really centered offense that was really, really impressive. But they did also struggle with a few other areas as well. One of the biggest problems they did have was almost on the penalties side of the ball. The Jets committed 76 offensive penalties that year, which was the second most in the American Football League, and they also committed 28 turnovers. However, though, it was the third fewest in the AFL at that time. At that time, they only lost 9 fumbles that year and only had 19 interceptions. But what's interesting here, and we're going to get to this when we talk about the Jets' schedule a little bit, is that Joe Namath, early in that season, he was a little turnover prone. He threw 5 interceptions, I believe, in like 2 of the first 4 weeks of play for the New York Jets, but then he finally started to correct himself, and during the second half of the season, the Jets did not turn the ball over as many times as they did early in the season. So that was a really big part of the Jets' offense to really have success in their championship season. So that does it for their offense, but let's take a look at the 1968 Jets defense here. Their defense was one of the best in the AFL during that period of time. In 1968, the Jets defense led the American Football League in the fewest total yards allowed that year and also allowed the fewest first downs in the league. And as far as their passing defense and their rushing defense, the Jets' passing defense was the second best in the AFL that year, and they also had the AFL's #1 ranked rushing defense that year as well. They really limited all the running backs that they went against during the 68 season and even into the postseason as well. The Jets defense, they had the third most sacks in the AFL that year. They had 43 sacks that year, and a credit to their rushing defense as well. They're limiting other teams' running backs that year. They only allowed 9 rushing touchdowns that year, which was the second fewest in the AFL as well. But here's the flip side, though. The Jets' turnover problems on the offensive side of the ball early. Their defense really saved their offense a couple of times, even though that their offense was turnover prone. The Jets defense, they had the second most takeaways in the NFL in 1968. They had 43 of them that year. They had 28 interceptions, which was the second most in the league, and they had 15 fumble recoveries, which was the third most in the American Football League as well. So really credit to Buddy Ryan and Walt Michaels, and really those 4 really key defensive players I was telling you about: Verlon Biggs, John Elliott, Jerry Philbin, and Al Atkinson. All 4 of them really helped out to help that Jets defense really become one of the best in the AFL during the last few years of their existence. So that does it, though, for their statistics here. Before I share, though, with you some highlights from the 1968 Jets season, let's take a quick look, though, at their schedule, and I'm going to single out some really impressive performances on the offensive side of the ball and even the defensive side of the ball a little bit during their 68 championship season. So let's take a look here at their schedule. So in 1968, though, the Jets actually had an extra week to prepare. They did not have a week 1 game that year, so they had an extra week to prepare for the start of the American Football League season. Their first opponent in week 2 was against the Kansas City Chiefs. They won this game by the score of 20-19. And in this game, Joe Namath, he had 302 yards passing in this game, and his Hall of Fame wide receiver Don Maynard, he had 203 yards receiving and scored 2 touchdowns, and a big win for the Jets in that one. Week 3, the Jets went to play the Boston Patriots that year. They won this game 47-31 was the score in this one. Joe Namath had 196 yards passing in this game, but did throw for 2 touchdowns. And as for the Jets' special teams and defense, they also scored 2 touchdowns themselves, and another big win for the Jets that pushed them to 2-0. But week 4 was the Jets' first step back, and this was one of Joe Namath's early miscue games here. They lost in week 4 to the Buffalo Bills. 37-35 was the score in favor of Buffalo in this one. Joe Namath, he did throw 4 passing touchdowns that game, but he also threw 5 interceptions, and I think it was 3 of them were returned for touchdowns. So that was a real killer for the Jets in this one. But their 2 receivers, George Sauer and Don Maynard, had really good games as well. They had 227 combined receiving yards, and they scored 3 touchdowns in that game. Week 5, the Jets went to play the San Diego Chargers. They won this game, a tight one. 23-20 was the score in this one. The Jets' running game got a little bit of a big boost in this one. Matt Snell and Emerson Boozer combined for 82 yards rushing in this game and scored 2 touchdowns. In the Jets' defense, they forced 3 interceptions in this game to really help them get back on the winning stage. They went to 3-1 as their record. But then week 6 against the Denver Broncos, this was another bad game for Joe Namath. He threw 5 interceptions in a 21-13 loss against the Denver Broncos. But once again, though, this was another big day, though, for George Sauer and Don Maynard. They combined for 16 catches and 331 yards receiving in this game, but they just could not score enough in order to get Joe Namath out of his funk of 5 interceptions. But in week 7, though, this was really when the Jets started to really find their formula for success for the second half of the season. Week 7, they beat the Houston Oilers 20-14 was the score in this one. Matt Snell and Emerson Boozer in this game. They had 100 combined yards rushing in this game. Matt Snell had a rushing touchdown himself, and even Joe Namath pitched in with a rushing touchdown as well in a big win for the New York Jets. Week 8, they went to travel to the Boston Patriots that year. 48-14 was the score. So this was a really big blowout win for the Jets that they really needed in this game. Matt Snell and one of the Jets' backup running backs, Billy Joe was his name. They combined for 117 rushing yards in this game. They scored 5 touchdowns, and the Jets' defense, another big day for them. They forced 5 interceptions off the Boston Patriots in that game. So a really big win for the Jets in that one. Week 9, the Jets played the Buffalo Bills in this game. They won it 25-21 was the score in this game. This turned out to be a really big game for their kicker, Jim Turner. He kicked 5 field goals in this game, and defensive back Johnny Sample got a big touchdown as well on an interception return, and a big win for the Bills in this one in Week 9. Week 10, the Jets went to play the Houston Oilers in this game. They won this one 26-7 was the score in this game. Bill Mathis, another backup running back that the Jets had that year, he scored 2 rushing touchdowns in this game, and George Sauer had another good game as well, 4 catches for 128 yards, and another win for the Jets that pushed their mark to 7-2 on the season. So a really good start for the Jets right before their really big streak to end the season. But Week 11, though, this was the interesting game of the American Football League history. A lot of people will remember this as the Heidi game, in which the movie Heidi was cut through the Jets and Raiders broadcast in this game. Jets lost this game. Score was 43-32 in favor of the Oakland Raiders. But this was a really big game, though, for Joe Namath to kind of get back into his gunslinging mode with limiting his interceptions in this game. Joe Namath had 381 yards passing in this game and had a rushing touchdown, and his battery mate, Don Maynard, had 228 yards receiving in this game and scored a touchdown. Unfortunately, though, the Jets did lose to the Oakland Raiders. They pushed their mark to 7-3, but they got back on the winning track the very next week. Week 12, the Jets went to play the San Diego Chargers in this game. 37-15 was the score in this game, and like I said, Joe Namath, getting him to settle down, he had a great game in this one. 337 yards passing in this game, 2 touchdowns, and Matt Snell and Bill Mathis also scored 3 rushing touchdowns in a big win for the Jets in this game, pushing their record to 8-3. Week 13, the Jets went to play the Miami Dolphins in this one. 35-17 was the score in this game. And this is interesting here. Both Joe Namath and his backup quarterback, Babe Parilli, got time to play in this game. They combined for 5 passing touchdowns in this game, and Don Maynard had another really superb game in his Hall of Fame career. 160 yards receiving in this game and scored 3 touchdowns. Big win for the Jets before their Week 14 game against the Cincinnati Bengals. They won this game 27-14 was the score here. Namath had 193 yards passing in this game, and Don Maynard and George Sauer, they combined in this game 161 yards receiving and scored 2 touchdowns. So really big for the Jets to really start centralizing what their offense was going to be before the postseason. But their last game of the season, though, was a really big win, though, here. They won against the Miami Dolphins again. Final score in this one was 31-7. More centralized, though, on the running game, though, in this game. Both Emerson Boozer and Bill Mathis scored 2 rushing touchdowns in this game, and a backup wide receiver happened to have one of his best games of the season. Bake Turner, who was a special teamer for the Jets that year, but he was also a third-string wide receiver. He ended this game with 7 catches for 157 yards.
When Joe Namath arrived in 1965, Maynard was the first to greet him. Joseph, I always call him, I said, I'm going to make you a better quarterback, and you're going to make me a great receiver. But I said, we're going to talk on every play, every route ahead of time.
You don't think it has to be that much on the money?
No, I mean, I don't think he has to lead it to the sideline that much.
And we're going to have the timing down so good that you can throw them blindfolded, and you'll never miss it.
The AFL's most feared tandem became Namath to Maynard.
Just went with a check with me about 80% of the time, 75% of the time, and called plays in the huddle the other 20, 25% of the time, and then if they weren't where we thought they should be, we'd audibilize off.
As he called it, and I got the signal, if I didn't want it, well, then I gave him my signal. And we only had one busted play in 9 years, and that's the first game Joe played in.
In the 1968 season opener, Namath's bombs to Maynard torched one of the league's best defenses. The following week, the offensive onslaught continued. Through 2 weeks, Namath and the offense could do no wrong, but it wouldn't last. Namath's inconsistent play would return and threaten to ruin the Jets' season. The Jets' 1968 road to a championship hit a detour in Buffalo, a place that had special meaning for defensive end Jerry Philbin.
I went to the University of Buffalo, and I had a vendetta going against the Buffalo Bills because they didn't draft me out of college. They thought I was too small. I couldn't make it in the on their team. So I was always really, really up for the Buffalo Bills.
My roommate drives me to the airport. He's an ex-ball player. He says, Joe, gosh, you guys are 19 points favored. What do you think of that? I said, well, we got the best defense in the league. I don't know how they can score.
Namath threw 5 interceptions. 3 were returned for touchdowns, and the Jets suffered a stunning defeat.
Philbin's always got some great lines. And when we got ready to leave, Philbin stood up and said, Namath, this week we're wearing green.
Philbin's remark paled in comparison to the tongue-lashing Namath received on the flight home.
Walt Michaels, our defensive coordinator, sends for me to come up and sit down and talk to him. And I went up and I sat down with Walt, and I could feel the heat coming from that chair. He was seething. I mean, and he's no linebacker, you know. Walt was seething, and he explained to me that we had the best defense in the league, that Buffalo had a rookie quarterback. What in the heck were we doing offensively trying to do that? And you know what? I agreed with him. I agreed with everything he said. He was right.
The next week against San Diego, Namath chose a cautious approach and did not throw an interception. Still, the Jets trailed the Chargers by 4 with 5 minutes left. Namath marched the team to the Chargers 1, where the Jets faced 4th and goal.
Namath calls it, the crowd standing, and here's a handoff.
In the final minute, quarterback John Hadel drove the Chargers into field goal range. Instead of playing for the tie, San Diego tried to beat Johnny Sample deep for the win. Hadel, hurried by Philbin, rushed his throw. Sample intercepted, and the Jets won the game. The Jets appeared to be back on a winning track, but old habits die hard. 19-point favorites against Denver, Namath again threw 5 interceptions. In the final seconds, Namath had a chance to salvage a tie. The loss dropped the Jets to 3-2.
We should have won this game handily. Joe Namath went out and had his worst game ever. Even after the game, he said that he stunk, and he did stink.
Namath had regressed, and defensive coordinator Walt Michaels was furious. Instead of again confronting Namath, Michaels met with the one player he knew could get Namath's attention, number 22, Jim Hudson. Hudson was Michaels' starting safety, but more importantly, he was Namath's best friend on the team.
The thing that changed, I think, our whole season, Walt Michaels went to Jim Hudson after that game and said, "You've got to talk to Joe. You got to tell him to take the pressure off himself. Put it on the defense. We've got a great defense. Let the defense make the opponent make the mistakes." And you know something? Joe heeded that advice. We had a team for once. We had a team, and the momentum was really on the way.
Against the Oilers, the Jets trailed by 1 with less than 5 minutes to play. Namath drove the Jets 80 yards for the go-ahead touchdown. On the ensuing kickoff, Philbin's hit sealed the victory. In the next 3 games, the winning formula stuck. The AFL's #1 defense continued to force turnovers. Namath sacrificed for the good of the team. He threw for less than 200 yards and did not have a touchdown pass in 4 straight games. The Jets won all 4. The Jets were now 7-2, and the lesson was clear. What they needed to become champions was not just Namath's arm, but his head and his heart. In Week 10, Joe Namath faced the team that broke his cheekbone 1 year earlier, the Oakland Raiders.
There was a lot of anger on our team, and a lot of anger in the Oakland Raiders team. We just didn't like each other, I guess.
And Oakland, who was always thought of as the most penalized team, and they were, we went in there, and all of a sudden, we were the most penalized team.
The Jets were flagged 13 times, and safety Jim Hudson was ejected.
When he came out, he gave the sign to the whole stand at Oakland, both hands. He gave him the bird. Gee whiz, and here comes the paper cups and everything else.
The Jets continued to lose players. The best passing combination in the league made up for it. Joe Namath threw for a season-high 381 yards. Don Maynard had 228 yards receiving, a franchise record that still stands. With 65 seconds left, the Jets took the lead. What happened next will always be remembered as a landmark moment in the history of televised sports. Oakland went on offense as the clock struck 7 o'clock Eastern Time. NBC on the East Coast switched away from the game to show the movie Heidi. The Raiders then beat Hudson's replacement, Mike D'Amato, for the go-ahead score. On the ensuing kickoff, the Raiders scored again. 2 touchdowns in 9 seconds. The Jets had lost, and the coaches were furious.
The officials have their own room, and it was right next door to the visiting team's locker. Walt Michaels was accusing him of getting paid off by Al Davis, and so he was banging down the doors and just yelling all these crazy things.
The Jets closed out the 1968 season with 4 decisive wins. They finished 11-3 and won the AFL Eastern Division by 4 games. The writers named Joe Namath MVP of the offense and Jerry Philbin MVP of the defense. By the end of the season, the 2 honorees were able to laugh at matters that once divided them.
And Joe, again, our congratulations. And on behalf of the Metropolitan Football Writers, they are presenting this watch to you, which I know you will wear and take good care of and be on all team meetings on time because of.
Welcome back, everybody, to 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. We're going to continue with our look at the 1968 New York Jets postseason schedule after I was able to show you some of their regular season highlights thanks to America's Game, their phenomenal work by NFL Films on the 1968 New York Jets. At the end of talking about their postseason schedule and their statistics, I'm actually going to play for you the rest of the 68 Jets season and get Don Maynard's, Jerry Philbin's, and Joe Namath's reactions to the AFL Championship game and their upset in Super Bowl III over the Baltimore Colts. But before we do that, though, let's round it out. Let's round out the Jets' schedule with the AFL Championship and the Super Bowl. So after the Jets' 11-3 regular season record, they went into the AFL Championship game against the defending AFL champions, the Oakland Raiders, who had previously won a playoff game to decide who would be representing the AFL Western Division in the 68 AFL Championship game. So both those teams met, and it was the Jets that came out on top in this one. 27-23 was the final score in this game. Joe Namath had 266 yards passing in this game, and he also threw 3 touchdowns in that game. 2 of them were to his trusty wide receiver, Don Maynard, who had 118 yards receiving, and the 2 receiving touchdowns I just talked about. His other touchdown was thrown to his tight end, Pete Lamons, and the Jets defense did a really good job shutting down Daryl LaMonica and the Raiders for the rest of the game to really preserve the Jets' win and their first AFL Championship title, to really send it home for the New York fans then. But their season did not stop there, as, of course, 2 weeks later they went on to play in Super Bowl III against the Baltimore Colts, who a lot of people really considered big favorites over the New York Jets in that Super Bowl. I believe there were some people calling them 17.5 to 22-point favorites in this game. So Jets were huge underdogs here, but somehow they were able to really generate a great game plan against the Baltimore Colts and won the Super Bowl by the final score of 16-7. This was a really solid day for Joe Namath in this game. He had 206 yards passing, no touchdowns, no interceptions, which was really beneficial to the Jets. And his fullback, Max Snell, had a phenomenal game, 121 yards rushing, and scored a rushing touchdown for the only touchdown the Jets scored in the Super Bowl. And then 3 field goals from Jim Turner really helped the Jets really dominate the Baltimore Colts in that game. And then the Jets defense really came alive as well, really shutting down NFL MVP quarterback Earl Morrall, and also in relief Johnny Unitas. They forced 4 interceptions and a really big win for the Jets franchise. That is still their only championship of the Jets franchise still to this day. So a phenomenal storybook season, it seems like, for the 1968 New York Jets, and we will, of course, look into their reactions to both the AFL Championship and the Super Bowl just a little bit later here. But before, though, we do that, though, let's take a look, though, at some of the other key offensive statistics for the 1968 New York Jets during their run to their AFL championship and their Super Bowl. So let's start out with Joe Namath, who earned AFL MVP honors in 1968 and Super Bowl MVP honors in Super Bowl III. So during the regular season, Joe Namath, he finished with 3,147 passing yards. He only threw 15 touchdown passes that year, but only threw 17 interceptions. So it was a really good job by Namath, really limiting the amount of turnovers that he had at the start of the season, and then really held his poise in check for the second half of the season and even into the playoffs as well. And he really cut down his 1967 season when he did throw 28 interceptions. And Namath also had 2 rushing touchdowns in the 1968 season. So a really great year for Joe Namath in 1968. His 2 running backs behind him, Emerson Boozer, he finished with 441 rushing yards during the 68 season. He rushed for 5 touchdowns, and he also received 12 catches for 101 yards, and he also received an AFL All-Star bid for his efforts during the regular season. So a good year for Emerson Boozer. His fullback, Matt Snell, he finished with more rushing yards than Emerson Boozer. Actually, he rushed for 747 yards. He scored 6 touchdowns, and he also had 16 catches for 105 yards and a receiving touchdown during the 68 season. But unfortunately, though, he did not receive an AFL All-Star bid. So he kind of got snubbed for a really good year, even though Emerson Boozer had a better year than Matt Snell did, but he received his AFL All-Star selection. Namath's 2 wide receivers, George Sauer and Don Maynard, these guys were huge catalysts for the Jets and really helping them in the postseason as well. George Sauer, he finished with 66 catches during the regular season for 1,141 yards and scored 3 touchdowns to earn AFL All-Star bids and AFL All-Pro as well. So George Sauer really establishing his legacy. As I said earlier, his father was the general manager of the New York Titans in 1962. 6 years later, his son really performs one of the best seasons of his career to earn 2 really distinguished bids to the AFL All-Star Game and the AFL All-Pro list as well. Namath's Hall of Fame wide receiver Don Maynard, also another really good year for him as well. He had 57 catches during the regular season for 1,297 yards and scored 10 touchdowns to receive an AFL All-Star bid, not All-Pro, but just only AFL All-Star bid for Don Maynard. So those 2 receivers really gelled well with Joe Namath during the entire season. And even Namath's tight end, Pete Lamons, got into the action a little bit as well. He finished the regular season with 32 catches for 400 yards and scored 3 touchdowns. And also, like I said earlier in our broadcast, Namath's offensive line did a phenomenal job protecting him that year. Both his left tackle, Winston Hill, and his right guard, Dave Herman, received AFL All-Star bids to really solidify that Jets offensive line that did a phenomenal job protecting Joe Namath during his MVP season during the AFL year in 1968. So that does it for their key offensive statistics for their players. Let's take a look at the defensive players as well. Of course, really credited to them to really solidify a really talented Jets staff. Like we talked about earlier as well, Jets defensive line coached by Buddy Ryan. All 3 of his defensive linemen played phenomenal all season long. Jerry Philbin, the Jets defensive end, he received AFL All-Pro bids and an AFL All-Star bid. Defensive tackle John Elliott, he was an AFL All-Star selection. And defensive end Verlon Biggs also was an AFL All-Star selection as well. So Buddy Ryan, phenomenal job in 1968 and one of his first pro coaching jobs with the New York Jets, and he really did a phenomenal job coaching all 3 of those defensive linemen to receive AFL All-Star bids in the very same year. Phenomenal job there by Buddy Ryan. As for the Jets linebacking unit, we talked about Al Atkinson at the at the beginning of our broadcast here. He finished the regular season with 2 interceptions, and he received an AFL All-Star bid as a result of that. But they also had a really other good linebacker who was an outside linebacker. He was on the left side of the Jets linebacking core. His name was Ralph Baker. He finished the 1968 season with 3 interceptions, and the Jets got him, actually. He was a 6th-round draft pick in 1964 from Penn State University. So a really good steal for the Jets during the 64 draft, and Baker did a phenomenal job that season for the Jets, as well as Larry Grantham as well, who was the Jets' right outside linebacker. He did a really good job solidifying a really talented linebacking core as well for the New York Jets. The Jets secondary as well, you meant America's Game mentioned one of them in safety Jim Hudson, who was Namath's best friend on the team in 1968. He was a really big catalyst for them, but really all 4 of the Jets secondary unit players did phenomenal jobs for the New York Jets during their 68 season. Let's start out with their cornerback, Johnny Sample. He had 7 interceptions during the 1968 season, and he returned 1 of them for a touchdown against the Buffalo Bills in Week 9. He was actually signed by the Jets in 1966, 3 years before they went on to 1968. And what's interesting here, actually, is that Johnny Sample, he actually played cornerback for Weeb Ewbank with the Baltimore Colts, actually, in 1958 and 1959 before signing with the Jets in 66 and being a real catalyst for them in 1968. So he had a real interesting advantage against his former team, knowing Johnny Unitas really well and knowing the kind of offense that the Baltimore Colts still continue to run all those years later. He was a really dominant force in that secondary unit. Jim Hudson, on the other hand, though, he had another really good year as well. He finished the regular season with 5 interceptions, and Hudson was an undrafted free agent from the University of Texas in 1965. So once again, just another gem that the Jets continued to find either in the late rounds or even undrafted free agents that continued to really do well for the Jets throughout their transition process that ended up in their championship season in 1968. Another safety the Jets had that was really good was Bill Bayard, and he finished the regular season with 4 interceptions, and he was also one of the Jets' primary returners that year with 18 punt returns. And once again, he was another undrafted free agent the Jets received. He was signed in 1963 from San Francisco State. That's where he came from. So again, just phenomenal job by the Jets scouting department and really finding these guys that made big contributions to the Jets roster. And finally, their last secondary player was cornerback Randy Beverly. He also had 4 interceptions during the regular season, and he had a return touchdown in Week 2 against the Boston Patriots in that game. And another undrafted free agent as well. He ended up coming from Colorado State in 1967, just a year before the Jets, of course, won in 1968. So just phenomenal work by the Jets, really finding these big, talented players that really helped them to really perform well for the Jets during the 1968 season, all on the defensive side of the ball. Fantastic players that they were able to develop. And finally, let's take a little look at the Jets' special teams as well. Of course, we talked about kicker Jim Turner. He had perhaps his best season in 1968 with the New York Jets. He was 34 of 46 on field goal attempts, and he made all 43 of his extra points to lead the AFL with 145 points scored that year. So he received an AFL All-Star selection for that. His punter, Curly Johnson, he had a phenomenal year as well, kind of like what Paul McGuire was to the Buffalo Bills in 1964. Curly Johnson had a perhaps even better year than McGuire did for the Bills in 64. Johnson had 68 punts and averaged 43.8 yards per punt in 1968, which was the second highest yards per punt average in the AFL during that year. Unfortunately, though, he was snubbed, for an AFL All-Star selection as well, despite a phenomenal year, really pinning his opponents back to really solidify that Jets defense to stop their opponents. And also the Jets had a pretty good primary kick returner as well. Earl Christie was his name. He had 25 kick returns that year and averaged 24 yards per kick return, and he also contributed to the Jets defense as well with an interception. And once again, following the undrafted free agent trend as well, he was an undrafted free agent from Mid-Eastern Shore in 1966. So phenomenal job once again by the Jets special teams coaches finding these gems to really help them deliver a championship.
The Super Bowl, to me, was an easy game. The only pressure game I had was the AFL championship. That's the game you got to win to get to the Super Bowl.
The weather for the championship game was foul. I mean, it was foul. The field was frozen and lumpy, and the wind was gusting to like 40 miles an hour. I mean, it was heavy wind.
The wind was one problem. The Raiders' defense was another. Some of the hits Namath took were legal, some weren't.
The first half was a rough half, physically.
Again, the Raiders had injured him. His finger was dislocated, and the constant pounding had taken a toll.
You get smelling salts, you snap back too. The rest of you feels all right. And if you can get back to the moment, then you go.
Namath again showed his trademark toughness and never missed a snap.
Namath back to pass on second down, throws for the end zone, touchdown for Maynard.
The Jets brought a 4-point lead into the fourth quarter. Namath called for Maynard to again run the square out to the sideline.
The wind was blowing unbelievable, and the wind caught it.
It is intercepted by Atkinson at the 30, down to the 25, the 20. He's down to the 10, the 5, and he is knocked out of bounds.
Joe's always been a football player, and he just didn't give a good tackle. Boy, I mean, he nailed the guy.
Namath was in pain, but failing to complete the pass to Maynard hurt even more.
Even when he crowds, it's good.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I forgot to tell you, I guess in the film it looked good.
Oh, well.
He's crowding because he's not looking at me.
For the first time in the game, the Raiders went ahead. Namath's interception had given away the lead. His best receiver knew how to get it back.
I said, Joe, I got a long one when you need it.
I told the team that I was going to call one play, but be alert for the audible that I'd go to if Maynard's situation presented itself. In other words, if the DB, Atkinson, climbed up in a bump and run.
Jump to him. You gotta get a score off, man.
We got up there, boy, and sure enough, Atkinson climbed up on Don. Check to the audible. Wonderful protection.
Namath dropping back to pass. He is looking, he is going to throw long for Don Maynard. And Maynard makes the pass down to the 10, and he is dumped out of bounds on the 8-yard line. A great over-the-shoulder catch, Don Maynard against George Atkinson.
It was the greatest catch I ever made, and don't run it back because I might miss it.
With the go-ahead score in reach, Namath showed his maturity as a quarterback by remaining patient.
Namath looking for the end zone, throwing, touchdown to Maynard. Joe Namath throwing to Don Maynard. He was not the intended original receiver.
Namath was looking to his left toward George Sauer, had time to change, look completely across the field to Don Maynard.
I knew the Raiders as a ball club, they don't ever give up, and you got LaMonica behind the center, and here they come.
Defense, just keep your
guys now. Keep your poise. Don't hit them late or anything. No penalties.
Six weeks after the Heidi game, the Raiders stood 12 yards away from another miracle comeback. But this time, the winds of fortune and of Shea Stadium were at the Jets' back.
2:20 to play. First and 10 of the New York 13. LaMonica back to pass. Rookie throwing a swing pass behind. He threw the ball behind Charlie Smith. It's covered by the Jets. That was a lateral pass. It was not a forward pass.
We going to the Super Bowl.
When Namath signed and underwent knee surgery, the Jets doctors gave him 4 years. 4 years was all it took. The Jets were AFL champions.
Never dreamed it would come this quick.
Absolutely. It's quick. 4 years.
You know, you think it's...
Took a long time coming. 4 years. You want to win every year, first year on.
Winning. Nothing else matters to me. Winning. Whether I catch 1 or 10. Nothing else matters.
Congratulations. Oh, you son of a gun, boy. Great guys, I'll tell you. We're going to get it. That's happy for you.
We celebrated like it was a Super Bowl afterwards. We were throwing champagne around like it was crazy. It was just unbelievable.
You know, your entire life as an athlete, you're wanting to win a championship, whatever level it's on. And here we were going for the world championship.
I said, well, men, we all going to get the loser's share. All you got to do is go out there and play a little extra and you can get the winner's share. And then there's always those guys that says, oh, I want that ring, I want that ring. And my comment, I care less about a ring, I want the $15,000.
The NFL representative in Super Bowl III was expected to do the same. Odds makers had the Baltimore Colts as anywhere from 17 to 22-point favorites. Some were calling the Colts the greatest team ever assembled. They outscored their opponents by more than 18 points per game, still a record in the Super Bowl era. Johnny Unitas was injured, but in his absence, quarterback Earl Morrall won the league MVP. Morrall's favorite receiver, John Mackey, was one of the best tight ends ever to play the game. In the NFL championship game at Cleveland, the Colts humiliated the only team all year to beat them. None of this impressed Joe Namath.
I think Monica throws better than Morrall.
Namath would list 5 AFL quarterbacks he thought were better than the NFL's reigning MVP. Then, at the Miami Touchdown Club, he would say the words that will forever live in pro football lore.
I didn't realize I had even said it, first of all. You know, there was a wise guy in the back of the room that started this business, and I just told him what I felt. You know, we're going to win the game, I guarantee you. One guy picked up on it, I believe, and that was Edwin Pope from the Miami Herald. And I didn't know about it till the next day when Coach Ewbank said, we got to have a meeting. And I apologized to Coach Ewbank and everything, and then turned it around, kind of. I said, but Coach, you know, it's your fault. Weeb said, what? What do you mean? I said, well, gee whiz, Coach, you've given us all this confidence. You know, you're telling us we're going to win. I mean, I believe you. We're going to win this game.
Namath believed in his team, and his conviction was contagious. Even one of his harshest critics was convinced Namath would lead the Jets to victory.
When he guaranteed that, he meant it. And you know, that really meant something to me as a player and to the defense and to the offense. You got a quarterback that's this tough. He can back up what he says with the football. Believe me, he can back it up.
Going back and forth, the offense and defensive guys kind of talk, how's things going, said, well, we're going to score good, we're going to be all right, we're going to be balanced. And the defensive guy said, well, we're going to intercept four passes. I said, well, that's great. That'll help out.
Moments before kickoff, the only voices Namath heard were the ones inside his head.
You try to keep yourself focused and think of your job. But when we were getting ready to walk out as captains for the coin flip, I looked across the field, and I saw Johnny, and I saw those uniforms. I kind of, for the first time, separated myself from right there and just looked and went back home to Beaver Falls and just had all these flashes about, yesteryear and where we were right then. This is it. This was it.
Well, you've all read and heard all kinds of pregame dope during the week. I think one big sidelight has been Joe Namath. Joe Namath, of course, is the man that the Colts have to stop. But Namath has not been bashful this week. He has downgraded quarterback Earl Morrall, and he has said that the Jets are going to win. He doesn't even predict it. He said, I guarantee a Jet victory.
Attitude is a whole lot in life, and I had a terrific attitude about that game, and I believe our team did too. The other side may have thought they were ready. They weren't ready.
They should have been very upset that Joe guaranteed the game. If they were as good as what they said they were, they should have came out and beat the shit out of us. They didn't do it.
5 times the Colts threatened in the first half. All 5 times they failed to score.
For New York. They had Jimmy all alone, and they didn't see.
We had a good game plan. We knew they weren't going to see some of the things we were doing in those days the AFL was doing. We confused them.
The Jets' offense hoped to frustrate Colts defensive end Bubba Smith. Number 67 tackle Dave Herman was in charge of blocking him.
Bubba was the best defensive end going at that time. I mean, he was a giant, he was quick, he was strong, he was aggressive, you know, he had all the tools. Herman would have nightmares, literally. Knocked his wife out of the bed, that kind of stuff, man. He's got to block Bubba, you know. Dave stayed in his chest all day long.
Namath received great protection, but his weapons were limited. Don Maynard was hampered by a sore hamstring.
I had the injury that people supposedly knew about, but maybe after the Oakland game, everybody thought maybe I was completely well.
Didn't want Baltimore to know anything. Coach Ewbank didn't want Baltimore to know anything.
Rather than altering their game plan, the Jets sent Maynard deep early. The pass did not connect, but the play had served its purpose.
They doubled Maynard every play, which left Snell, Boozer, Mathis, Sire one-on-one most of the time.
Maynard, acting primarily as a decoy, did not register a catch all game. Namath picked apart the Colts by spreading the ball to the rest of the team.
No penalties, let's get a touchdown up there. Here, get a touchdown, no penalties.
Namath, red hot. Everybody thought he'd get killed in this game. He has killed Baltimore so far. That Snell's been the outstanding runner so far. He's in there, Snell scored.
In the second half, Namath extended the Jets' lead. Just when the Jets were on the brink of putting the Colts away, Namath left with an injured thumb, while Unitas replaced Morrall.
And it's ironical that the young fellow, Namath, went out with an injury, and Unitas gets almost a standing ovation here, which he should. One of the greatest players in the history of pro football.
I tell you, when Johnny Unitas came in the game, you're concerned and all of that.
Get him, Big Green, get him, Big Green.
Unitas, instead of becoming the Colts' savior, nearly symbolized their desperation.
Intercepted. Andy Beverly downs it. That's the 4th interception by the Jets in the game. And they have still shut out the mighty Colts.
They were like a punch-drunk fighter who just got up after 10 rounds and he says, where is he? I can beat him. I know I can beat him. They were beaten. They were done.
He may be sitting in one of sports' greatest upsets in history.
Namath returned and led the Jets to one last score. In the final quarter, Namath put the game in the hands of number 41, fullback Matt Snell. Snell ate the clock, moved the chains, and propelled the Jets into history.
The game is over. The New York Jets are the world champions. champions. They have upset the Baltimore Colts and beat them handily here today.
You gonna get a check for $15,000? I said, I don't want no check. I want mine in dimes. I want mine in dimes. I want to feel it.
The quarterback who nearly lost his team by being undisciplined had now won a championship by becoming the consummate team captain. Namath did not call a pass in the fourth quarter, yet he was the game's most valuable player.
To me, Dave Herman and Matt Snell were two guys on our offense that carried that game. I did a good job, but MVP? Okay, we'll take it. I'm glad.
Got to have confidence in your team. Got to have confidence in yourself. And if you don't have that confidence, you can't play football. We all felt we could win. We won. Baltimore felt they could win. They lost.
Joe, you're king of the hill.
No, we're king of the hill. We got the team, brother.
After winning Super Bowl III, Joe Namath was asked if this should be considered an historic win.
I don't know about that. I know it's a hell of a loss for those folks that picked it the other way.
This time, the player who had become larger than life had sold himself short. Pro football would never be the same.
The next week, we went up to the AFL All-Star game. All those guys, they all just came up. Man alive, it's great, we all beat them.
The significance of that game for the players around the country, the other AFL players, how they felt, how their families felt, and how their fans felt. It was really more than just the Jets winning against the Colts. We won for the league, the AFL. We got to see Pete Rozelle. He said, fellas, that check that you got, he said, you're going to spend that. He said, but that ring you're going to get, he said, that's the intrinsic value. He said, the significance of that, nobody can ever take it away from you. That is the intrinsic value. And I never forget that. I never used that word in my vocabulary before, but I used it ever since.
The greatest part of all was that's tough. I guess the fact really of just the great teammates that you won and lost together, celebrated and cried about.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Namath.
We have about 20 guys back here who won the World Championship, but you can't see. I wish you'd stand up. Fellas, come on. This is our football team. A lot of guys here. The World Championship football team.
The same three words always come out when I look at it. We did it. We did it. Every day in the locker room, doing training camp, doing a regular season, you know, teams, guys talk about winning. They want to win a championship. Well, we did it. You know, I get goosebumps talking about it now. Doing it as an underdog is wonderful, too. There's a lot of underdogs out there in the world. And sometimes they need some reassurance that they can come back, man. Cop an attitude. Get mean and go do it. I like that.
Everybody wants to talk about the Jets as being one of the greatest teams to pull off a major upset in Super Bowl III. But how do they fare, though, against the 1972 Miami Dolphins? And that's going to be our topic for our next broadcast on 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. Cut off, though, as I said earlier in my other previous videos. If you have an idea or a story that you would like me to do some research into, or if you want me to talk about something about your favorite NFL team at all, just be sure to send a comment or a post on either my Facebook account, my Twitter account, or even my YouTube account, and I will be sure to take a look into it later in this 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey video podcast. So I hope you guys have a great night, everybody, and I hope everybody still continues to stay safe during these difficult times.
CBS Sports thanks you for watching this presentation of the National Football League.